Okay, so the piece I will be covering here is the creation of Adam, created by the acclaimed Renaissance artist Michelangelo. Created by famed Renaissance artist Michelangelo Buonarroti in 1508, the creation of Adam stands as one of the most iconic and exemplary works of not only the Renaissance period, but of the very history of art itself. At the age of 33, Michelangelo was still ascending towards great fame, and although having already sculpted the David and succeeding in making a name for himself, Michelangelo was a relentless artist, never allowing himself to slow down. Besides his great talents, he was also acknowledged for having a strong temperament, which paired well with his menacing hunger for respect and fame. By all accounts, in what social exchanges Michelangelo faced, he exuded a sharp tongue and an anti-sentimental wit to match. Right, so here's a couple of examples of remakes on Michelangelo's creation of David. Just a few of the best ones I found here. I personally like the one in the bottom right corner with the Mac in Adam's lap. Alright, so under his defiant will and audacious quest for acclaim, the Sistine would be among Michelangelo's last frescoes he would execute before he would begin to spin further into a perpetual state of reclusion, of religious self-reflection and pessimism during what was a preparation for his own mortality. The piece that will be analyzed is his creation of Adam, which has as of recently come to the attention even more so than previously before of Dan Brown type folks, with an inexhaustible amount of time and frequent flyer miles, and who, thanks to Frank Meshberger, are looking to redefine Michelangelo's intent through the creation of Adam's hidden secrets. It sounds quite romantic, but look, who wouldn't be excited about this? Well, maybe the church and maybe even Michelangelo. If after all he didn't intend to hide a giant brain, or any anatomy for that matter, within his images, as being inconsistent with the church after the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Or, in addition to this, Michelangelo, being a rather pessimistic person himself, would eventually come to contemplate the fate of his very own soul in light of the connection he held for so long with religious patrons and subject matters. Well, then one or both might be upset. But Michelangelo's life isn't exactly a linear path, and at one point or another Michelangelo may have lived a life of which he later thought in his mind to be of less noble pursuits. A life not so concerned with the church or salvation, but instead one spent living with the company of intellects and wealth during his adolescent years at Lorenzo de' Medici's court. So to understand what it is we may not know about his famous Sistine work, or what others might have us believe, it's best to begin by briefly examining Michelangelo's early life in an emerging Renaissance Italy. So Michelangelo began his life under a business-minded father who was adamant that Michelangelo follow after him. A young Michelangelo, however, refused this notion, knowing that this was not his interest. After his father relented, he instead sent young Michelangelo to study grammar with the humanist Francesco da Urbino. This would become a relevant starting point in shaping Michelangelo's outlook. After having shown his artistic aptitude, he was selected to attend the court of Lorenzo de' Medici. Then later attending Medici's Humanist Academy, whose basis was built along the lines of philosophies such as Platonism and Neoplatonism, it is here that, immersed in the company of learned men and philosophical intellects, Buonarroti would gain his basis to interpreting the world, religion, and the ideal human form in his works. So now then would be a good time to ask, what is humanism and why does this matter? Well, humanism basically gave people a reason to strive, both in their personal and maybe more so professional lives. It encouraged people to live a more potential fulfilling life by becoming enriched in the world's vast teachings and cultures, as well as putting man at the center of the universe. Part of what may have inspired Michelangelo in this respect was the cultivation of knowledge of the human anatomy, though not simply for aesthetic purposes, but also for exploring the connection that it, such as the mind, might have had in relation to oneself and one's connection to God and religion. Michelangelo, after all, had a great deal of inner turmoil throughout his life, and although a religious man, he might have examined these ideas and questions through his works. Okay, so what does this have to do with the creation of Adam? Well, although he scoffed at the offer to paint the Sistine from Julius II because he held himself in less esteem as a painter, Michelangelo could not say no to Julius. Equally so, Michelangelo had also suspected that the project was a malicious setup by other rival artists designed to exploit his weakness as a painter and discredit him among his patrons. But when it came time to discuss the ceiling's theme and subject, Michelangelo assertedly carried himself despite any reluctance. He insisted on having artistic control over the project. In keeping with humanism, Michelangelo's work reflected not only the best demonstration of the ideal human form, but also the human will. Along with this will to paint an entire ceiling is a question of whether or not Michelangelo had actually toiled on this entire project himself. Though Michelangelo would have you believe the ceiling was done only by him, in all likeliness Michelangelo would have had a number of assistants at his disposal. Prep work on the ceiling or mixing ingredients for the paints and plasters would have been the ideal task assigned to these assistants. After having actually begun the ceiling, Michelangelo faced setbacks in his work. Among other things, his frescoes had contracted a fungus which was not uncommon to painting in this kind of medium. Damp conditions within the chapel, poor weather, or plaster not applied thinly enough could devastate a section of work, which is exactly what it had done while Michelangelo worked in a technique called buon fresco, which is a method of using a fairly wet plaster to paint on. Much like oil paints, wet plaster has a time frame where it can be reworked before drying, allowing an artist to make corrections. So for Michelangelo, the correction was scraping all his ruined up work off the ceiling and starting fresh with a thinner layer of plaster. Alright, so let's check out the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel was built in 1477 by Pope Julius II's uncle, Pope Sixtus IV. The reason that Julius II wanted Michelangelo for the job was not because the chapel walls were empty. In fact, they were already adorned some 20 years earlier by many of Michelangelo's predecessors. Julius wanted Michelangelo because by this time Michelangelo was already a renowned sculptor, and not to mention already had commissions by Julius for other works such as Julius's family tomb, which I don't think was ever finished. Secondly, Julius, otherwise known as Warrior Pope, felt that in order to cement a legacy for himself in the church, he would need a monumental symbol that would serve as a testament to this, triumphing over any known man or institutional power before or after his own time. All right, so I'll also mention that Julius II, obviously, patron of the arts, he commissioned Michelangelo, Raphael, among other Renaissance artists at the time, to do works for him, both in sculpture and in painting. And he died shortly after the ceiling's completion, and there was always a sort of tension between him and Michelangelo, at least more so on Michelangelo's side, where he wasn't sure whether he was going to get paid or not, or how long this piece was going to continue. And also, him and Julius had a pretty tumultuous relationship. Julius actually struck Michelangelo with one of his staffs after Michelangelo had given him his normal attitude when Julius asked to see the work of the 16 in progress while he returned from one of his battles. Alright, so finally, the creation of Adam. Alright, the image itself is one of 9 scenes depicted along the central axis, or highest part of the ceiling taken from the book of Genesis. In it we see the very sculpturesque definitions of the two main characters, God and Adam. As God descends from the heavens in what appears to be a red silk shroud, he carefully reaches out his right arm, extending his index finger towards Adam. Opposite from him, a very organically earthbound Adam looks out lethargically while also extending his arms and hands out to meet God's. Though his pose and effort seem almost exhausted and his reach more or less delicate and soft. Surrounding God is his cadre of angels, while to his left we have what might be that of either the Virgin Mary or Eve, though this remains a source of contention among scholars and art historians today. Then, of course, you have the broader art community at large who eagerly will postulate their own guesses, such as Maria Rezpinska claims in her article that the female figure to God's side is that of Sophia, the goddess of wisdom. Now, of course, this isn't an outlandish claim, since Sophia, throughout history, has been mentioned both in church doctrine and also Neoplatonism, to which Michelangelo was devout of both. But this, of course, points to the obvious fun in interpreting art, which is depending on what theology or philosophy you try to project on the context of art, here being Michelangelo's works, you will always, almost likely, arrive at a different interpretive conclusion. With that being said, now would be a good time to begin exploring two interesting takes on the creation of Adam by those compelled to produce them. The first one is none other than the God placenta theory. And I should probably mention first that the reason people will speculate these sort of things about Michelangelo's and other Ren artists' works is because as a part of perfecting the human form in sculpture, Michelangelo had spent a great deal of time actually dissecting cadavers in order to better understand the anatomy which gave the body its form, such as the muscle, skeletal, and ligament structures. Therefore, he would have been familiar with what many speculate in his works to be anatomical images. Getting back to the placenta theory, the idea is that in the image, God is shown not endowing Adam with the spark of life, but instead umbilically detaching from Adam. In other words, Adam is being born unto the world. The two arms in extension represent the umbilical cord being broken, signifying Adam's departure from God. And the big billow that God's driving is actually a uterus complete with a membrane and, of course, amniotic fluid flowing below, shown in the blue sort of river-ish looking thing. With that being said, the authors to this claim coincidentally have backgrounds in gynecology and placenta enzyme biology. So, of course, you be the judge. Alright, next we have the more well-known theory, which is that of Dr. Frank Meshberger's flying brain image. What Dr. Meshberger speculates is that in this image we have God and Adam, but upon closer inspection of the billowing shroud that God descends in, we have what looks like a brain, or more specifically the view of its cross-section, if you were to split it down the middle. After taking the silhouette of the image and superimposing it on the image of a cross-dissected brain, the result is that the two images appear to convincingly match. What Meshberger believes about how this relates to the scene is that God is not giving life to Adam, as Adam is already awake and fully formed, but is actually giving Adam intelligence. This would actually seem to make sense, since when you look at the image, Adam is in this reclined position wearing a facial expression that conveys a sense of helplessness, as if he doesn't have the ability or cognitive function to remain upright on his feet, let alone fend for himself. Also, his nudity and complete absence of any sort of garments or tools seems to point to an otherwise primitive existence. Meshberger goes on to point out more details lending further credibility to his claim, but really just looking at this image with this idea in mind, one doesn't have to stretch the imagination too far to see the similarity between the two. And again, with that being said, the author of this theory was not Mr. Meshberger. No, it was Dr. Meshberger. So you have to wonder if the medical community doesn't have maybe a predisposed bias in seeing images of a uterus or brain in everything they look at long enough. Which, although in this instance, that might just be the case.